The transport ship Meridian's edge shuddered violently as plasma fire tore through its hull. Captain Sarah Chen gripped her command chair, watching the bridge systems fail one by one. Red warning lights bathed everything in an ominous glow while alarms screamed their mechanical panic. "Hull breach on decks 4 through 7, her engineer shouted over the chaos. "We're losing atmosphere fast." Sarah's jaw tightened. They were transporting medical supplies to the outer colonies when the Vextar raiders appeared. The insectoid species had been hitting human supply lines for months, but this deep in neutral space they should have been safe. "All hands to escape pods," Sarah ordered, her voice cutting through the noise. "This is not a drill." The ship lurched again, throwing crew members against bulkheads. Sarah could hear the groaning of metal as the superstructure began to fail. Through the main view screen, she caught glimpses of the planet below, a world marked on their charts as uninhabited, covered in dense forests and rolling hills. Her communications officer, Lieutenant Rodriguez, looked up from his console with panic in his eyes. "Captain, the escape pod bay is compromised. Only one pod is functional and it's damaged." Sarah's heart sank. 23 crew members, one escape pod. The mathematics were brutal and clear. "Get everyone to pod 7, she commanded, already moving toward the emergency controls. "I'll buy you time." "Captain, you can't." "That's an order." Sarah's voice brooked no argument. She'd served in the Colonial Defense Force for 15 years, rising through the ranks not because she was the smartest or strongest, but because she never left anyone behind. Today wouldn't be the first time. The bridge shook again as another section of the ship vented into space. Sarah worked frantically at the engineering console, rerouting power to the remaining thrusters. If she could keep them stable for just another few minutes, pod away. Rodriguez's voice crackled through the comm system. "Captain, the pod is away." Sarah allowed herself a small smile. Her crew would make it. The pod's beacon would guide rescue ships to their location within days. She turned back to the controls, trying to angle the dying ship away from their landing zone when the deck beneath her feet simply disappeared. The explosion threw her through what had once been the bridge viewport. In the terrible silence of space, Sarah tumbled end over end, watching pieces of her ship scatter like metal confetti against the starfield. Her emergency suit sealed automatically, but she could already see the damage readout scrolling across her helmet display. The suit's thrusters were offline, life support was compromised, and she was falling toward the planet's atmosphere. As the first wisps of atmospheric gases began to heat her suit's outer shell, Sarah Chen closed her eyes and prepared for what would likely be her final ride. The emergency suit wasn't designed for atmospheric entry. It was meant to keep someone alive in space for a few hours, not serve as a re-entry vehicle. But sometimes the universe has other plans. Sarah regained consciousness hanging upside down from a tree, 30 feet above the forest floor. Her helmet display flickered weakly, showing critical damage to nearly every system. The suit had somehow held together during the fiery descent, its heat shields mostly intact. But the impact with the forest canopy had finished what the explosion started. She hung there for several minutes, taking inventory. Her left arm was definitely broken. She could feel the bone grinding when she tried to move it. Her ribs ached with each breath, suggesting at least one was cracked. But she was alive, which was more than she'd had any right to expect. The release mechanism for her safety harness was jammed. Sarah twisted awkwardly, using her good arm to reach the manual override. The harness released suddenly, dropping her hard onto a thick branch 15 feet below. She scrambled for purchase, bark scraping against her damaged suit before managing to steady herself. The climb down was slow and painful. Each movement sent spikes of agony through her injured arm and ribs. By the time her boots touched solid ground, Sarah was breathing hard and fighting waves of nausea. The forest around her was alien but beautiful. Massive trees with silver bark stretched toward a pale blue sky, their leaves a deep purple that rustled with an almost musical sound in the gentle breeze. Strange flowers dotted the undergrowth, their petals seeming to glow with their own inner light. In the distance, she could hear the sound of running water. Sarah's helmet display finally died completely, leaving her with only the damaged suit's basic life support. She estimated maybe 6 hours of recycled air remaining. The broken arm would heal, the ribs would mend, but suffocation was a more immediate concern. She needed shelter, water, and a way to breathe the local atmosphere, assuming it was even compatible with human physiology. The ship's atmospheric readings had indicated the planet was habitable, but those sensors could have been wrong. As Sarah began walking toward the sound of water, she caught movement in her peripheral vision. Something large was moving between the trees, keeping pace with her but staying hidden. She froze, suddenly very aware that she was completely unarmed. The ship's armory had been on Deck 5, which was now scattered across several square miles of space debris. The movement stopped when she did. Sarah's training kicked in. In the Colonial Defense Force, they'd taught her that most predators were curious but cautious. Show fear, and you became prey. Show aggression, and you became a threat to be eliminated. The key was to project confidence while avoiding direct confrontation. She resumed walking, moving steadily but not hurriedly toward the water sound. The parallel movement continued, now joined by others. Sarah counted at least 4 separate sets of footsteps matching her pace through the underbrush. When she reached the stream, a clear, fast-moving waterway about 20 feet across, Sarah knelt carefully at the edge. The water looked clean, and her suit's remaining sensors detected no obvious toxins. She unsealed her helmet, took a cautious breath of the alien air, then a deeper one. The atmosphere was thinner than Earth normal, but breathable. It tasted faintly of ozone and something floral. Sarah allowed herself a moment of relief before cupping water in her good hand and taking a careful sip. It was then that her watchers decided to reveal themselves. They emerged from the forest like ghosts materializing from shadow. Sarah's first impression was of wolves, but larger, much larger. These creatures stood nearly 4 feet at the shoulder, with lean, powerful builds covered in dark fur that seemed to absorb light. Their eyes were an unsettling shade of amber, and they moved with the fluid grace of apex predators. But it was their behavior that truly caught her attention. Instead of circling for an attack, they sat, all 4 of them arranged in a semicircle about 20 feet away, watching her with what could only be described as curiosity. Sarah slowly stood, keeping her movements smooth and non-threatening. One of the creatures, the largest with graying fur around its muzzle, tilted its head and made a low, rumbling sound that wasn't quite a growl. "Well," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the still air, "I don't suppose any of you know the way to the nearest human settlement." The pack leader's ears perked forward at the sound of her voice. It stood, took a few steps closer, then sat again. The amber eyes never left hers. Sarah realized she was looking at intelligence. These weren't just animals, they were thinking, evaluating, making decisions. And for reasons she couldn't fathom, they'd decided she was interesting rather than threatening. Which was good, because without weapons or backup, interesting was about the best she could hope for. The standoff lasted nearly an hour. Sarah remained motionless by the stream. While the 4 wolf-like creatures observed her with patient intensity, she used the time to study them in return, noting details that her military training had taught her to catalog. They moved with coordinated precision, occasionally exchanging glances that seemed to communicate volumes. When one shifted position, the others adjusted accordingly, maintaining their formation. These weren't pack animals operating on instinct. They were a tactical unit. The pack leader, distinguished by its size and the silver threading through its dark fur, finally stood and approached the water's edge. It kept its distance from Sarah but lowered its head to drink, amber eyes never leaving hers. The message was clear. This was neutral ground. Sarah slowly knelt again and refilled her water supply, using the emergency pouches built into her damaged suit. The creature watched her every movement but made no aggressive gestures. When she finished, it huffed once, almost like approval, and trotted back to its position. As the hours passed, Sarah began to understand she was being evaluated. These creatures were trying to figure out what she was, why she was here, and whether she posed a threat to their territory. The fact that they hadn't attacked suggested she was passing their tests, but barely. When the alien sun began to set, casting long shadows through the forest, the pack leader made its decision. It stood, barked once at its companions, and began moving upstream along the water's edge. The others followed, but slowly, clearly expecting Sarah to come with them. She hesitated. Following unknown predators into the wilderness went against every survival instinct she possessed, but staying by the stream in the dark, injured and alone, seemed even more dangerous. The creatures had had multiple opportunities to attack and hadn't taken them. Whatever they wanted, it wasn't her immediate death. Sarah fell into step behind the pack, maintaining a respectful distance. Her broken arm throbbed with each step, and the damaged ribs made breathing difficult, but she forced herself to keep pace. Showing weakness now could change the entire dynamic. They traveled for nearly 2 hours through increasingly dense forest. The trees grew larger and stranger, their silver bark taking on an almost metallic sheen in the fading light. Bioluminescent fungi began to appear, casting eerie blue-green glows that made navigation possible even as true darkness fell. The pack finally stopped at what appeared to be a natural clearing surrounded by enormous tree trunks. But as Sarah's eyes adjusted, she realized it wasn't natural at all. The spacing was too regular, the ground too level. Someone, or something, had created this space deliberately. In the center of the clearing stood a structure that defied easy description. It seemed to grow from the earth itself, all organic curves and flowing lines. The walls appeared to be made of the same material as the tree bark, but shaped into smooth, interlocking panels. Soft light emanated from within, visible through what might have been windows. The pack leader approached the structure and made a series of complex vocalizations, not howls or barks, but something closer to language. Sarah felt the hair on her neck rise as she realized she was listening to communication, not animal sounds. A opening appeared in the structure's wall, not a door opening, but the material itself reshaping to create a passage. A figure emerged that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. It was humanoid, but clearly not human. Tall and graceful, with elongated limbs and features that seemed carved from living wood. Its skin had the same silver bark texture as the trees, and its eyes were the deep green of old forests. When it moved, it did so with a flowing motion that seemed almost like dancing. The creature, person, approached the pack leader and knelt, placing what appeared to be a hand on the animal's head. They remained like that for several moments, perfectly still, before the being rose and turned its attention to Sarah. Those green eyes studied her with an intelligence that was unmistakably sapient. Sarah found herself being evaluated by yet another alien mind, but this time by something that might actually be able to communicate with her. The being gestured toward the structure, the movement graceful and clearly inviting. Sarah looked back at the pack, which had arranged itself in a loose circle around the clearing. They were still watching, still evaluating, but their posture had relaxed. Whatever test she'd been undergoing, she seemed to have passed. Sarah approached the structure cautiously. The being stepped aside, allowing her to enter first, a gesture of trust that wasn't lost on her. Inside, the space was larger than the exterior suggested, with walls that curved organically and provided multiple levels connected by ramp-like pathways. The light came from the walls themselves, which glowed with soft bioluminescence. The being moved to what appeared to be a workspace filled with objects Sarah couldn't identify. It selected several items and approached her, making soft sounds that might have been attempts at communication. When Sarah didn't respond, it gestured toward her broken arm. Understanding flooded through her. This person, was offering medical assistance. Sarah nodded slowly and allowed the being to examine her injuries. Its touch was gentle but confident, prodding carefully at her broken arm and ribs. The being made more sounds, these ones clearly expressing concern. It moved back to its workspace and began combining materials with practiced precision. Sarah watched, fascinated as the being created what appeared to be a medical compound using methods she couldn't begin to understand. When it returned, it held a bowl filled with a luminescent paste and strips of material that looked like they'd been grown rather than manufactured. The being gestured for permission before beginning treatment. Sarah nodded, and those gentle hands began applying the paste to her injuries. The effect was immediate and startling. The pain began to fade, replaced by a cool, tingling sensation that spread through her damaged tissues. As the being worked, Sarah tried to process what was happening. She'd crashed on what the chart said was an uninhabited planet, only to discover not one but two intelligent species living here. The wolf-like pack hunters who'd found her, and this tree person who was now providing medical care with technology she couldn't comprehend. The being finished its treatment and stepped back, making sounds that somehow conveyed satisfaction. Sarah experimentally moved her arm and found the pain greatly reduced. She could actually flex her fingers without agony shooting through her shoulder. "Thank you," she said, knowing the being couldn't understand the words but hoping her tone would convey gratitude. The being tilted its head at her voice, then moved to another part of its living space. It returned with what appeared to be food, fruits and vegetables unlike anything from Earth but recognizably nutritious. Sarah accepted the offering gratefully, discovering that alien food could actually taste quite good. As she ate, the being settled nearby and began making more complex vocalizations. Sarah realized it was trying to communicate, possibly attempting to learn her language just as she was trying to understand its sounds. Outside, she could hear the pack settling in for the night, their presence a protective barrier around the structure. For the first time since her ship had been attacked, Sarah felt something approaching safety. But questions nagged at her mind. Why had these beings helped her? What did they want in return? And most importantly, how was she going to survive on this world long enough for rescue to arrive? As if sensing her thoughts, the being stood and moved to what appeared to be a viewing area. Sarah followed and found herself looking out at the night forest through a transparent section of wall, in the distance visible between the trees. She could see lights, not the bioluminescent glow of the forest, but the harsh artificial illumination of technology. The being pointed toward the lights and made sounds that were clearly warning calls. Whatever was out there, these forest dwellers considered it dangerous. Sarah's blood ran cold as she realized the implications. She wasn't the only one who had crashed on this world, and whoever else was here might not be as friendly as her current hosts. The being turned to her and made more urgent sounds, pointing first at the distant lights, then at her, then back at itself. The message was clear. Danger was coming, and they were all in this together now. Sarah nodded her understanding. Whatever was happening on this world, she was no longer just a crashed pilot waiting for rescue. She was now part of something larger, caught between the peaceful forest dwellers and whatever threat those distant lights represented. The being seemed satisfied with her response, and guided her to what appeared to be a sleeping area. As Sarah settled in for the night, she could hear the pack moving restlessly outside, their senses alert for any sign of approaching danger. Tomorrow, she realized, would bring new challenges. But tonight, for the first time since her crash, she wasn't alone. Sarah woke to the sound of urgent barking from the pack outside. The bioluminescent walls of the shelter had dimmed to simulate night, but now they pulsed with an alarming red glow. Her tree-person host was already moving, gathering items with swift, practiced motions. The being approached her and made rapid, complex sounds while gesturing toward the entrance. Sarah didn't need translation. The message was clear. Time to go. She struggled to her feet, surprised to find her injuries much improved from the previous night's treatment. Her arm still ached but was functional, and the sharp pain in her ribs had faded to a dull throb. Whatever that healing pace contained, it worked faster than anything in human medicine. Outside, the forest was alive with tension. The pack had formed a defensive perimeter around the clearing, their amber eyes scanning the darkness between the trees. In the distance, Sarah could see moving lights, not the steady glow of settlements, but the harsh beams of searchlights sweeping through the forest. The pack leader approached and made a series of low rumbles to the tree being, who responded with equally urgent sounds. Sarah watched this interspecies communication with fascination, even as fear knotted in her stomach. Whatever was out there was getting closer. The tree being turned to her and pointed deeper into the forest, away from the approaching lights. It made questioning sounds, clearly asking if she could travel. Sarah nodded, though she had no idea what they were running from or where they were going. They moved through the forest like ghosts, the pack ranging ahead and to the sides while the tree being guided Sarah along paths she never would have seen on her own. The forest itself seemed to help them, branches bending aside and undergrowth parting to create silent passages. After an hour of careful movement, they reached another clearing where Sarah got her first clear look at their pursuers. Through the trees she could see them, tall insectoid figures in powered armor carrying weapons that hummed with energy. Her heart sank as she recognized the design. Vextar. The same raiders who had destroyed her ship were now hunting her on the surface. But something was wrong with the scene before her. The Vextar were moving in a search pattern, but their formation was all wrong for raiders. This was systematic, thorough, the kind of search pattern used when looking for something specific and valuable. Sarah's blood ran cold as understanding hit her. They weren't just hunting her. They were looking for the escape pod. Her crew was still down here somewhere, and the Vextar wanted them alive for some reason. The realization made her stomach churn with possibilities, none of them good. The tree being touched her shoulder and pointed to a new path. Sarah started to follow, then stopped. She couldn't just run away while her crew was in danger. These beings had helped her, shown her kindness, but she had responsibilities to her own people. She turned back toward the Vextar searchlights and took a step in that direction. The pack leader immediately moved to block her path, making warning sounds. The tree being joined it, clearly confused by Sarah's change in direction. How could she explain? These beings had no way to understand human concepts of duty and loyalty. They were offering her safety, and she was trying to run toward obvious danger. Sarah knelt and began drawing in the soft earth with a stick. First, she drew a simple representation of her crashed ship. The tree being watched with interest as she added figures representing her crew, then drew the escape pod moving away from the ship. Finally, she drew the Vextar figures surrounding the pod. The tree being studied her crude drawings for several moments, then made soft sounds that somehow conveyed understanding. It looked up at Sarah and made questioning noises while pointing first at her drawings, then at her. Sarah nodded vigorously. Yes, those were her people. Yes, she needed to help them. The being and the pack leader exchanged rapid vocalizations. Sarah could sense disagreement, possibly argument, in their tones. The pack leader's body language suggested it thought she was insane to consider approaching the Vextar. The tree being seemed more thoughtful, studying the drawings again. Finally, the tree being made what sounded like a decision. It spoke to the pack leader in firm tones, then turned to Sarah and gestured for her to follow. But instead of heading away from the danger, it began moving parallel to the Vextar search pattern. They traveled for another hour, staying just outside the raiders' detection range. Sarah began to understand they were being led to an observation point where they could assess the situation before acting. Her respect for these beings grew. They weren't just offering blind help, but tactical support. The observation point turned out to be a hilltop overlooking a valley where the escape pod had come down. Sarah's heart clenched as she saw her crew through the scope-like device the tree being had produced. They were alive but clearly prisoners, surrounded by Vextar guards and some kind of temporary containment field. But what truly chilled her was what else she saw in the valley. The Vextar hadn't just captured her crew, they were building something. Large mechanical structures rose from cleared areas of the forest, and more ships had arrived since the initial attack. This wasn't a simple raid anymore. This was an invasion. The tree being made urgent sounds and pointed toward other hilltops around the valley. Sarah looked and felt her stomach drop. More observation posts, all occupied by tree beings watching the Vextar activity. This entire region was under surveillance by the native population, which meant the peaceful forest dwellers weren't as helpless as they seemed. They were gathering intelligence, preparing for something. The question was what? Sarah spent the next several hours observing the Vextar operation while trying to communicate with her hosts. Through gestures and simple drawings, she managed to convey basic information about the raiders, their technology, their methods, their likely objectives. The tree beings absorbed this information with disturbing efficiency. They asked questions through gesture and expression that showed they understood military concepts better than she'd expected. When she drew diagrams of Vextar weapon systems, they nodded with recognition and made sounds that suggested they'd encountered similar technology before. As the day wore on, more forest dwellers arrived at the observation post. Not just tree beings, but other species Sarah hadn't seen before. Creatures that looked like living crystals. Beings that seemed to be made of condensed shadow. Entities that defied easy description. All of them studied the Vextar operation with the same systematic intelligence. Sarah realized she'd stumbled into something much larger than a simple first contact situation. This world wasn't uninhabited. It was home to an entire alliance of species that had remained hidden from galactic civilization. And now they were preparing to defend their home against invasion. The pack leader approached with what appeared to be a weapon. It was organic in design, growing from what looked like a specially cultivated plant. But Sarah could sense the power contained within its biomechanical structure. The creature offered it to her with ceremonial formality. Sarah accepted the weapon, understanding the significance of the gesture. She was being invited to join their war effort. These beings were offering her the chance to fight back against the raiders who had destroyed her ship and captured her crew. But as she held the alien weapon, Sarah felt the weight of a larger decision. Getting involved in this conflict would mean taking sides in what might become a much larger war. The Vextar wouldn't stop with one world. If they were building a permanent base here, it was part of a larger expansion plan. The tree being approached and made sounds that somehow conveyed a question. Sarah looked down at the weapon in her hands, then back at her captured crew in the valley below. She thought about her responsibility to her people, to the colonies they'd been trying to supply, to the entire human sphere that the Vextar were threatening. When she looked up, her expression was grim but determined. The tree being seemed to understand and made sounds that might have been approval or welcome. Around the observation post, the various species were making similar weapons available to each other. Sarah checked the bioweapons function, finding controls that seemed intuitive despite their alien design. The pack leader watched approvingly as she demonstrated basic competency with the device. As night fell over the valley, Sarah Chen, crashed pilot, wounded survivor, and now reluctant warrior, prepared to enter a battle that would determine the fate of two civilizations. In the distance, Vextar searchlights continued sweeping the forest, unaware that they were now the ones being hunted. The tree being touched her shoulder and pointed toward hidden paths that led down into the valley. Other teams of forest dwellers were taking similar routes, moving to positions around the Vextar encampment. Sarah took a deep breath and followed her new allies into the darkness. Her crew was down there somewhere, waiting for rescue they probably didn't expect. She intended to make sure they lived to see another day, even if it meant starting a war to do it. The forest around them seemed to whisper with anticipation as dozens of species prepared to reveal themselves to the galaxy for the first time in centuries. And at the center of it all, one human pilot was about to discover what it truly meant to fight alongside beings who had made protecting life their sacred duty. The attack began at midnight when the forest itself came alive. Sarah crouched behind a cluster of bioluminescent ferns, watching in amazement as the trees around the Vextar camp began to move. What she had thought were natural formations revealed themselves as camouflaged warriors. Branches that had seemed random proved to be carefully positioned weapons. The very ground beneath the raiders' feet started to shift and buckle. The tree being beside her made soft sounds that Sarah had learned meant, wait. Around the camp's perimeter, she could see the pack taking positions, their dark fur making them nearly invisible in the shadows. Other forest species were moving with equal stealth, approaching from angles the Vextar couldn't possibly anticipate. The first sign of attack came from the crystal beings. They emerged from what had appeared to be rock formations, their faceted bodies suddenly blazing with internal light. The brilliant flashes temporarily blinded the Vextar sensors, creating gaps in their detection grid. That was the signal everyone had been waiting for. Sarah's pack leader let out a howl that was immediately answered by dozens of others throughout the forest. But this wasn't the sound of wild animals, it was a coordinated battle cry that sent chills down her spine. The forest dwellers weren't just attacking, they were announcing their presence to the galaxy. The Vextar response was swift but confused. Alarms blared through their camp as weapon systems came online, but they were scanning for conventional threats. Their sensors couldn't lock onto enemies that registered as plant life, mineral formations, or simple wildlife. Sarah watched a Vextar patrol pass within 10 feet of a shadow being that remained perfectly motionless against a tree trunk. The raiders' advanced sensors detected nothing unusual, even as the shadow creature prepared to strike. The tree being touched Sarah's arm and pointed toward the containment field where her crew was being held. Through the chaos of the developing battle, she could see her people pressed against the energy barrier, trying to understand what was happening. Getting to them would mean crossing 50 yards of open ground swarming with Vextar soldiers. It was suicide under normal circumstances, but nothing about this situation was normal. Sarah checked her bioweapon one more time. The tree being had shown her how to adjust its settings. It could fire stunning energy pulses, explosive projectiles, or something called growth accelerants that caused rapid plant expansion wherever they hit. The variety of options suggested these beings had been preparing for war longer than anyone realized. The tree being made ready sounds and began moving toward the camp. Sarah followed, trusting in alien tactics she didn't fully understand. Around them, the battle intensified as more forest species revealed themselves. A group of Vextar soldiers opened fire on what they thought was a small grove of trees. The trees promptly returned fire with bioweapons that launched seed-like projectiles. Where the seed struck, vines erupted from the ground, wrapping around the raiders' legs and weapons with crushing force. Sarah saw her opening, While the Vextar focused on the obvious threats around them, she sprinted toward the containment field. Her tree-being companion followed, moving with that flowing grace that made targeting nearly impossible. They were halfway to the prison when a Vextar officer spotted them. The insectoid warrior raised its weapon, mandibles clicking with hostile recognition. Sarah was human, probably the pilot they'd been hunting, and worth capturing alive. Sarah dove behind cover as energy bolts seared the air around her. The tree-being moved to flank the officer, but more Vextar were converging on their position. They were about to be overwhelmed when salvation came from an unexpected source. The pack arrived like a living storm. 4 massive wolf-like creatures burst from the undergrowth with coordinated precision. They didn't attack like wild animals driven by hunger or territory. They moved like soldiers, each one targeting a specific enemy while covering their teammates' movements. The pack leader leaped directly at the Vextar officer, massive jaws clamping down on the raider's weapon arm. The bio-armor held, but the impact sent both combatants tumbling. The other pack members engaged the remaining soldiers with similar tactical awareness. Sarah reached the containment field and began examining the control console. The Vextar technology was familiar from her military training, but the interface had been modified in ways she didn't recognize. She could see her crew inside. 22 people, all apparently unharmed but clearly frightened by the battle raging around them. "Captain," Lieutenant Rodriguez pressed against the energy barrier. "What's happening out there?" "Those things, are they attacking us or helping us?" "Helping," Sarah said, still working on the controls. "I'll explain later. Right now, we need to get you out of here." The tree-being appeared beside her and made sounds that somehow conveyed urgency. Sarah looked up to see Vextar reinforcements approaching their position. The pack was holding them back, but barely. That's when Sarah noticed something that changed everything. The Vextar weren't just randomly shooting at the forest dwellers. They were specifically targeting the tree beings while trying to capture the animal species alive. The raiders wanted specimens, not conquest. This wasn't an invasion. It was a harvesting operation. The realization filled her with cold fury. These peaceful beings who had helped her, treated her injuries, welcomed her as an ally. They were being hunted like exotic animals for some cosmic zoo or laboratory. Sarah's anger sparked something she hadn't felt since her academy days. The same protective rage that had driven her to shield her crew from the ship's destruction now extended to her new allies. Nobody harvested people on her watch. She abandoned the subtle approach to the containment controls and used her bioweapon's explosive setting on the power coupling. The containment field flickered and died, freeing her crew in a shower of sparks. "Everyone out," she shouted. "We're not alone on this world, and we're all in this fight together." Her crew scrambled from the defunct prison, many of them stopping in amazement at their first close look at the tree being. Rodriguez approached the alien cautiously, then extended his hand in the universal gesture of greeting. The tree being studied the offered hand for a moment, then reached out with its own appendage. The contact seemed to convey volumes of information in both directions. When they separated, both beings made sounds that somehow expressed mutual respect. "Captain," Rodriguez said, "I think we just made our first alien friend." "We made our first alien friends yesterday," Sarah corrected. "Right now, we need to help them win this fight." She quickly explained the situation to her crew while the battle continued around them. The Vextar were regrouping, bringing heavier weapons to bear on the forest dwellers. The initial surprise was wearing off, and the raiders' superior firepower was beginning to tell. But her crew were all Colonial Defense Force veterans. They'd signed up to protect human colonies, but the principle extended to protecting any innocent people from raiders and slavers. "What are our orders, Captain?" Rodriguez asked, speaking for the entire group. Sarah looked around at the chaos of the battle. Tree beings were falling under concentrated Vextar fire. Pack members were wounded, their alien blood staining the forest floor. Crystal creatures lay shattered where energy weapons had found their mark. These beings had welcomed her, healed her, armed her, and trusted her with their secrets. Now they were dying to protect not just their own world, but the humans who had crashed into their lives. "Our orders are simple," Sarah said, raising her bioweapon. "We make sure these bastards regret ever coming to this world." Her crew cheered, the first sound of human voices raised in battle cry that this planet had ever heard. They spread out to support their alien allies, using their military training to complement the forest dwellers' natural tactics. The tide of battle began to shift as human strategy merged with alien capabilities. Sarah's people provided tactical coordination, while the forest species provided intimate knowledge of the terrain and resources the Vextar couldn't anticipate. Sarah found herself fighting alongside the pack leader, their movements synchronized despite never having trained together, the tree being coordinated with Rodriguez as if they'd served together for years. Her engineer worked with a crystal being to overload Vextar power systems, using principles that bridged two entirely different technological approaches. As dawn broke over the battlefield, the Vextar began to retreat. Their harvesting operation had become a costly defeat, and their losses were mounting faster than they could justify to their commanders. Sarah watched through the scope of her bioweapon as the last Vextar transport lifted off, carrying the surviving raiders away from the planet. But she knew this victory was only temporary. The Vextar would return with larger forces, better prepared for the resistance they'd encountered. The tree being approached her, moving slowly due to injuries sustained in the fighting. It made sounds that conveyed both gratitude and concern, gesturing toward the sky where the Vextar ships had disappeared. "I know," Sarah said, understanding the unspoken question. "They'll be back, and next time, they'll bring everything they have." 3 days after the battle, Sarah stood in what could only be described as a war council. The meeting was taking place in a vast underground chamber she never would have suspected existed beneath the forest floor. Crystalline formations provided light while living walls pulsed with gentle bioluminescence. Representatives from every species on the planet had gathered. Sarah counted at least 12 different kinds of beings, from the familiar tree people and pack hunters to creatures that seemed to exist partially in dimensions she couldn't perceive. Each group had sent their leaders, and each leader was studying the humans with intense curiosity. The tree being who had first helped her, who she had learned was called something that translated roughly to branch who speaks for growth, served as a translator between the various species. But even with translation, the conversation was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. "The Star Hunters will return," communicated a being that looked like animated shadow. "Our watchers beyond the sky confirm large gatherings of their ships. They mass for true war, not harvesting." Sarah's blood ran cold. Vextar battle fleets meant orbital bombardment, planetary invasion, and the kind of total warfare that left worlds uninhabitable. Her crew's presence had escalated this from a secret raid to an open conflict. "How long do we have?" she asked. A crystal being chimed its response, harmonics carrying meaning in ways that bypassed language entirely. Branch who speaks translated. "Crystal Singer estimates 15 of your days before the first wave arrives. Perhaps 20 before the main force." Rodriguez whistled low. 15 days to prepare for a full-scale invasion. That's not nearly enough time. But the pack leader made sounds that Branch who speaks translated as disagreement. "Fleet Runner says we have been preparing for this war for many cycles. The time for hiding is ending. Now we discover if our preparations are sufficient." Sarah looked around the chamber, noting details she hadn't seen before. What she had taken for natural rock formations were actually weapons systems, their biomechanical components disguised as geological features. The walls themselves were riddled with passages that suggested a vast underground network. "You've been preparing for invasion?" she asked. "How long have you known about the Vextar?" The shadow being rippled with what might have been amusement. "We have known of the Star Hunters since they first began consuming worlds beyond our system. We have watched. We have learned. We have prepared." A new voice entered the conversation, something that looked like a jellyfish made of pure energy floating in a containment field. Its communication came as electrical patterns that made Sarah's hair stand on end. Branch, who speaks translated, "Storm Dancer says the preparations go deeper than weapons. They go to the heart of what it means to fight a war among the stars." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the underground temperature. "What do you mean?" The tree being gestured to what appeared to be a natural alcove. As Sarah approached, the wall became transparent, revealing a view that made her stagger backward in shock. Space. She was looking at deep space, but not from orbit. Somehow, this underground chamber had a direct view of the star field above the planet, and in that star field she could see ships, Not Vextar ships. These were vessels unlike anything in known space. Organic constructions that seemed grown rather than built. Crystalline structures that caught and focused starlight. Energy beings that moved through vacuum like fish through water. We are not as isolated as your people believe, Branch Who Speaks explained. This world is not hidden. It is a fortress. And you have arrived just as the siege begins. Sarah's mind reeled as she tried to process the implications. Humanity had made first contact with what they thought was a primitive world, only to discover they'd stumbled into the headquarters of an interstellar alliance that had been preparing for war with the Vextar for decades. Why didn't you make contact before? Rodriguez asked. If you knew about the threat, why didn't you warn the human colonies? The answer came from multiple beings simultaneously, their various forms of communication creating a symphony of meaning that Branch Who Speaks struggled to translate. Your people fight with metal and fire, taking worlds and changing them to suit your needs. For many cycles, we could not tell the difference between humans and star hunters. Only recently have we learned that some who sail between stars do so to protect rather than consume. Sarah understood. Humanity's expansion into space, their terraforming projects, their rapid colonization. From the outside, it probably looked exactly like what the Vextar were doing. The forest dwellers had been watching and waiting to see which kind of star travelers humans really were. And now, she asked. Now we have seen humans choose to fight beside strangers for no gain except preventing suffering. Now we know. A new urgency entered the chamber as more beings arrived with reports from across the galaxy. Sarah listened in growing amazement as intelligence flowed in from dozens of star systems. This alliance had agents and allies in places she'd never imagined. The scope of what she was learning was staggering. The Vextar weren't just raiders hitting isolated colonies. They were one arm of a massive expansion that threatened every inhabited world in the galaxy. And this alliance of hidden species had been the only thing standing between the raiders and total conquest. Your colonies, Stormdancer communicated through electrical pulses. They are next on the harvest list after this world falls. The Star Hunters have been patient, but their patience ends. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. Her crew's survival was no longer the only thing at stake. Every human world in the outer colonies was in danger, and the only possible salvation was standing in this chamber around her. What do you need from us? She asked. The question seemed to ripple through the assembly, translated into a dozen different forms of communication. The response was unanimous and immediate. Help us contact your fleet commanders. Help us coordinate our preparations with your military forces. Help us turn this from our secret war into a battle that all free peoples can win together. Sarah looked at her crew, seeing the same realization in their eyes. They weren't just survivors of a crash anymore. They were about to become the first human ambassadors to an interstellar alliance that could save or doom every human world in space. We can do that, she said. But you need to understand, human military commanders are going to need proof. They're going to need demonstrations, and they're going to want to know why they should trust allies they've never heard of. Branch Who Speaks made sounds that conveyed amusement. Proof we can provide. Trust we hope to earn. But first you must help us save your world that falls next. Consider it a demonstration of what our alliance can accomplish. Which world? Rodriguez asked. The shadow being rippled, and when Branch Who Speaks translated, Sarah's blood turned to ice. New Brisbane. Population 400,000 humans. Scheduled for harvest in 12 of your days immediately after the attack on this world fails. The Star Hunters believe it will be easy prey with its defenders focused on trying to rescue you. Sarah's home colony. The world where she'd grown up, where her family still lived. The Vextar were planning to use her crash as a key distraction, while they attacked the people she'd spent her career trying to protect. Then we'd better make sure their attack on this world doesn't just fail, she said grimly. We need to make it fail so spectacularly that they have no ships left to attack anyone else. The chamber filled with sounds of agreement from a dozen species. For the first time since the war began, the Hidden Alliance had human allies who understood both sides of the conflict. Sarah Chen, crashed pilot turned ambassador, was about to help plan the battle that would determine whether freedom or slavery ruled the stars. And she was starting to think they might actually have a chance of winning. The next 10 days passed in a blur of preparation that redefined Sarah's understanding of what was possible. The forest wasn't just hiding an alliance of species, it was hiding an entire civilization that had been preparing for this war longer than humanity. had been traveling between stars. Underground, the true scope of their preparations became clear. Sarah walked through caverns that stretched for miles, filled with bioships that pulsed with organic life, while crystal beings fine-tuned their energy systems. She watched shadow creatures phase in and out of reality as they tested stealth systems that could hide entire fleets. The pack hunters had evolved into something beyond mere predators. They were living weapon systems that could coordinate attacks across multiple dimensions. Your people will not believe this exists, Branch Who Speaks observed, as they toured a facility where energy beings were weaving what appeared to be solid light into defensive barriers. My people have trouble believing anything they can't shoot or scan, Sarah admitted, but they're also practical. When the Vextar fleet arrives, the proof will be pretty obvious. She'd managed to establish communication with Colonial Defense Force headquarters using a biotech transmitter that somehow bypassed every known form of detection. The conversations had been difficult. Admiral Harrison, her former commanding officer, had listened to her reports with barely concealed skepticism. Captain Chen, his voice had crackled through the organic communication system. You're asking me to believe that a supposedly uninhabited world contains an interstellar alliance that's been fighting the Vextar for decades. I'm asking you to send reconnaissance drones to New Brisbane, sir. If I'm right, you'll detect Vextar ships massing for attack. If I'm wrong, you've wasted a few drones. The silence that followed had stretched long enough for Sarah to wonder if the connection had been lost. When Harrison finally responded, his tone was grim. The drones are already in position, Captain. We've been tracking increased Vextar activity near New Brisbane for 3 days. How did you know? Because the same species that's been helping us has been watching the Vextar movements across this entire sector. Admiral, we're not just dealing with raiders anymore. This is a coordinated invasion of every human colony in the outer systems. Now, as the Vextar fleet approached, Sarah stood in the command center the Alliance had prepared for the coming battle. It was unlike any military facility she'd ever seen, a living organism that interfaced directly with its operators, processing information faster than any computer while maintaining the intuitive awareness of biological consciousness. Rodriguez was working with a crystal being to coordinate targeting systems. Her engineer had somehow learned to communicate with energy creatures that existed partially outside normal space-time. Each of her crew members had found ways to contribute that transcended every barrier of species and technology. Fleet contact, announced Storm Dancer, its electrical patterns painting tactical displays directly onto the command center's living walls. 47 Vextar vessels, including 3 heavy cruisers and a command dreadnought. Sarah studied the display. It was a massive force, enough to glass an entire world or harvest its population for the slave markets. Under normal circumstances, a Colonial Defense Force fleet of similar size would be needed to match them. But these weren't normal circumstances. Alliance fleet status? Sarah asked. Branch Who Speaks communicated with multiple species simultaneously, then translated the collective response. 63 bioships, 41 crystal constructs, 37 shadow vessels, and 14 energy beings capable of independent space combat, all positioned according to the plan. The plan, Sarah still couldn't quite believe it would work. Instead of meeting the Vextar fleet in open battle, the Alliance intended to use the planet itself as a weapon. The forest wasn't just camouflage, it was a massive biomechanical system that could extend its influence far beyond the atmosphere. Human fleet response? She asked. Admiral Harrison is moving the 3rd Fleet to New Brisbane as we discussed, Rodriguez reported. They'll be in position to intercept any Vextar ships that try to retreat in that direction. It was a gamble. If the Alliance's plan failed, the human fleet would be caught between the surviving Vextar forces and the main invasion fleet already positioned near New Brisbane. But if it worked, Vextar fleet entering engagement range, Storm Dancer announced. Sarah watched the tactical display as the raiders assumed standard invasion formation. They were clearly expecting minimal resistance from what their scouts had reported as a primitive world with a small human survivor group. They had no idea what was waiting for them. Begin Phase 1. Branch Who Speaks communicated to the Alliance fleet. The first sign of attack came from empty space. What the Vextar sensors read as vacuum suddenly filled with shadow vessels that had been hiding in dimensions their technology couldn't detect. The raiders' formation scattered as ships began taking fire from enemies that appeared and disappeared faster than their targeting systems could track. But that was just the distraction. Phase 1 was designed to draw the Vextar fleet closer to the planet, where the real trap was waiting. "They're taking the bait," Sarah observed as the Vextar command ship ordered its fleet to pursue the shadow vessels toward the planet's surface. The raiders entered the upper atmosphere expecting to face primitive air defenses. Instead, they found themselves flying through what appeared to be a cloud of spores released by the planet's biosphere. Their sensors registered the particles as harmless organic matter. They were wrong. Phase 2, Branch Who Speaks announced. The spores activated. Each one was a microscopic bioship carrying a specialized payload. They attached themselves to the Vextar vessels and began growing, spreading across hull plating like metallic moss. Within minutes, the raiders found their ships covered in organic matter that interfered with their sensors, communications, and weapon systems. But the spores weren't just disrupting the fleet, they were connecting it to the planet's bio-network. Suddenly, every Vextar ship became an unwilling part of the forest's extended nervous system. "We can see through their sensors now," Storm Dancer reported, its electrical patterns dancing with something that might have been joy. "We know their positions, their orders, their intentions. They have become part of us whether they wish it or not." The Vextar fleet tried to retreat, but it was too late. The crystal constructs emerged from hiding among the asteroid belt, their faceted hulls focusing the system's star into concentrated beams that sliced through raider shields like paper. Energy beings materialized directly inside Vextar ships, overwhelming their power systems from within. And from the planet's surface, the bioships launched. These weren't mechanical constructs but living creatures bred for space combat, each one unique and capable of adapting to enemy tactics in real time. They swarmed the Vextar fleet like antibodies attacking an infection. Sarah watched in amazement as the Alliance's plan unfolded with perfect coordination. Every species contributed their unique capabilities, while the bio-network coordinated their actions with inhuman precision. The Vextar, despite their superior firepower and numbers, found themselves outmaneuvered at every turn. "This is impossible," Rodriguez breathed as they watched a shadow vessel phase directly through a Vextar cruiser's hull, disrupting its internal systems before disappearing again. "No," Sarah corrected, finally understanding what she was witnessing. "This is what war looks like when every participant is fighting to protect something they love instead of something they want to take." The battle lasted 6 hours. When it ended, the Vextar invasion fleet was either destroyed or captured, with minimal losses to the Alliance forces. But more importantly, the biospores had transmitted everything they'd learned about Vextar technology, tactics, and strategy back to the planet's network. "We now know the locations of their bases, their fleet positions, their invasion timetables," Branch Who Speaks reported. "The Star Hunters intended to harvest our knowledge. Instead, we have harvested theirs," Sarah smiled grimly. "And now we take that knowledge to every free world in the galaxy." The hidden war just became a very public one. As she prepared to contact Admiral Harrison with news of their victory, Sarah realized that everything had changed. Humanity was no longer fighting alone against the Vextar threat. They had allies now. Strange, powerful allies who understood what it meant to defend freedom against those who would destroy it. The galaxy was about to discover that some wars were worth fighting, no matter how impossible they seemed. 6 months later, Sarah stood on the bridge of the Alliance, humanity's first biomechanical starship, built using combined human engineering and forest world biotechnology. It represented something unprecedented in galactic history, a vessel that was simultaneously alive and artificial, capable of growth and adaptation, while maintaining the reliability humans demanded from their technology. Through the bridge's living viewport, she could see the assembled fleet preparing for what historians would later call the liberation of Kepler Station, 300 ships from 47 different species, united under a banner that bore symbols from every member world of the newly formed Galactic Freedom Alliance. "Final preparations complete," reported Commander Rodriguez, now serving as the Alliance's first officer. His uniform bore insignia that combined human rank markers with the biotags that identified him to their alien allies. "All fleet elements report ready for jump." Sarah nodded, then activated the communication system that would carry her words to every ship in the fleet. When she spoke, Her voice was translated simultaneously into 46 different forms of communication. From the musical tones of the crystal beings to the electrical patterns of Stormdancer's people. All ships, this is Admiral Chen. 6 months ago, we were strangers from different worlds, different species, different ways of understanding the universe. Today we stand together as something the galaxy has never seen before. A true alliance of free peoples united not by conquest or commerce, but by the simple belief that every sentient being has the right to choose their own destiny. She paused, looking out at the fleet that represented everything they'd built together. Human vessels flew alongside bioships from the forest world. Crystal constructs moved in formation with shadow vessels that existed partially outside normal space. Energy beings danced between the larger ships like living escort fighters. The Vextar Empire believes that strength comes from taking what belongs to others. They measure victory by how much they can consume, how many worlds they can strip bare, how many beings they can reduce to slavery. They are about to learn that true strength comes from what we choose to protect. Reports flowed in from across the galaxy as other Alliance fleets moved against Vextar strongholds. The Hidden War had become a coordinated liberation campaign that was freeing enslaved worlds and dismantling the infrastructure of oppression that had terrorized the galaxy for centuries. Kepler Station has been a symbol of Vextar power for 50 years, Sarah continued. A fortress built on slave labor, maintained by fear, defended by those who profit from suffering. Today we break that symbol. Today we show the galaxy that no fortress is impregnable when free peoples stand together. Branch, who speaks, now serving as the Alliance's coordinator for biological systems, made sounds that the ship's translation system rendered as agreement and anticipation. The tree being had adapted to space travel with remarkable ease, and its presence on the bridge had become both tactically valuable and personally comforting to Sarah. Fleet, jump in 30 seconds, Rodriguez announced. Sarah felt the familiar sensation of the bioship preparing for faster-than-light travel. Unlike the mechanical stress of human jump drives, the Alliance seemed to gather itself like a living creature preparing to leap. The sensation was unsettling for human crew members, but had proven remarkably effective in combat situations. 10 seconds. Around them, space began to shimmer as nearly 300 ships prepared to translate across dozens of light years in perfect synchronization. The coordination required for such a maneuver would have been impossible with purely mechanical systems, but the bio-network that connected every Alliance vessel made it seem effortless. Jump. Reality folded, twisted, and reformed. The Alliance and its fleet emerged from hyperspace in perfect formation around Kepler Station, catching the Vextar defenders completely off guard. The massive station, a construct the size of a small moon, hung before them like a metallic cancer against the starfield. All ships, execute liberation protocol, Sarah ordered. What followed wasn't the conventional space battle that Vextar tactical doctrine anticipated. Instead of exchanging long-range fire, the Alliance fleet employed strategies that no purely technological civilization could counter. Shadow vessels phased directly through the station's shields, emerging inside critical systems to disable defenses from within. Crystal beings focused concentrated starlight into surgical strikes that severed specific components without causing massive explosions that might harm enslaved populations. Bioships extended tendrils that interfaced directly with the station's computer systems, turning the Vextar's own technology against them. And the pack hunters, now evolved into something resembling living starfighters, swarmed through the station's corridors faster than automated defenses could track. Their howls echoed through the communication channels as they coordinated rescue operations with an efficiency that amazed even their human allies. Slave quarters located and secured, reported Fleet Runner, the pack leader who had first found Sarah in the forest. 17,000 beings from 31 worlds, all alive, all ready for evacuation. Sarah felt a surge of satisfaction. Every operation focused first on saving the enslaved populations, then on capturing useful intelligence, and only lastly, on destroying Vextar assets. It was a philosophy that had confused their enemies and inspired their allies across the galaxy. Vextar command structure neutralized, added Stormdancer, its electrical patterns conveying the efficiency with which energy beings could disable electronic systems. Station surrendering. The battle for Kepler Station lasted 3 hours. When it ended, The Alliance had freed 17,000 slaves, captured intact examples of advanced Vextar technology, and added another liberated world to their growing coalition. More importantly, they'd proven once again that cooperation between species could overcome any purely military force. As Sarah watched the evacuation ships carrying freed slaves to safety, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The crash that had seemed like a disaster had become the catalyst for the most important alliance in galactic history. "Admiral," Rodriguez said quietly, "we're receiving a transmission from Earth. The Colonial Assembly wants to know when you're coming home." Sarah smiled, looking around the bridge at the collection of species that had become her family. Human crew members worked alongside tree beings and crystal constructs. Pack hunters coordinated with energy entities that existed partially outside normal space. Shadow beings provided tactical analysis, while biomechanical systems integrated information faster than any purely artificial intelligence. "Tell them I am home," she said, "and invite them to join us. There's a galaxy full of free peoples out here, and we're just getting started." Through the viewport, she could see the Alliance fleet forming up for the jump to their next objective. Somewhere out there, more enslaved worlds waited for liberation. More species hoped for freedom. More beings dreamed of a galaxy where cooperation meant more than conquest. Captain Sarah Chen had crashed on an alien world looking for survival. Admiral Sarah Chen was leading a galactic alliance toward a future where no one would have to crash alone again. The forest had taught her that strength came not from weapons or technology, but from the willingness to stand with others in defense of what mattered most. Now she was taking that lesson to the stars, one liberated world at a time. Behind them, Kepler Station began its transformation from fortress to refuge. As Alliance engineers worked with freed slaves to rebuild it as a symbol of liberation rather than oppression, ahead lay the next battle, the next rescue, the next step toward a galaxy where freedom meant more than just another word in the trader's lexicon. Sarah Chen had asked if she could step in. The galaxy had answered with a resounding yes.